Noah, Micah, big congrats to you guys on this film. It is a beautiful, beautiful film, beautiful story that you guys have crafted. It is playing very well among, I think, critics and audiences alike. I think one of my favorite reactions I've seen to it, I think by more than one critic, is the description that it's a warm hug of a movie.
Yeah.
That's like so appropriate. One critic even called it a ticket to salvation.
Wow.
That's an actual quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But playing extremely well in theaters, it turns out people really loved this Mr. Rogers guy, apparently. We all loved Mr. Rogers. Yeah, we talked to a lot of writers, Marvel writers and superhero film writers, and without a doubt, they were always hardcore fans of the material growing up. What were your own personal connections to Mr. Rogers? Were you know, Mr. Rogers fanboys in any way? I mean, we all had him in our living rooms, but what were your personal histories with him?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like I was a hardcore fanboy. I mean, he was certainly in the world. You know, my parents were both, public educators, so sort of in my world growing up. But I don't really have like strong memories of like him being my dad or feeling like. I mean, I just remember it kind of always being around and always being on. And
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was more of a Sesame Street guy. And it really wasn't until working on this film and then becoming a father myself that I really began to appreciate, that Fred Rogers is sort of a superhero, but who wears a cardigan instead of a cape. And he has sort of like deeply impacted, I think, both of our lives, not just, working on this movie, but just like being able to spend so much time reading what he wrote and watching every episode we could get our hands on.
I mean, he really has become like an amazing guide for our lives over the last 10 years of working on this project. Becoming, new dads I was a new dad right when it started. Those kids are now 10 and 12.
Yeah, it's been a journey for you guys.
It's been a journey, yeah. And Micah now has a 4-year-old. So it's like very much over the last decade, this movie and Fred Rogers really has been sort of guiding us through some of these harder life moments.
Tell us what first sparked the idea for the film. It's been 10, 12 years. Can you guys kind of give us a sort of a
Sure.
brief history of the project? I think
Yeah.
you wrote it on spec, right?
Oh,
We
yeah.
did write it on
Well, we
spec.
hired ourselves to write it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did it for exactly $0.
Yeah.
No, it started, like 10 years ago. I had a 2-year-old and a newborn, and I was a brand new dad and not particularly good at it, and really struggling, and kind of in a moment, a particularly frustrating moment, just put on an episode of Mr. Rogers onto the TV, and my very stubborn 2-year-old turned to the screen and started listening to Fred. He was talking about doing calisthenics. And she just like turned to the screen and then like started doing windmills. And I was like, oh my gosh.
Got that immediate effect.
I was
He
like,
had her.
she has never listened to me like that ever. What is he doing? Why is he so special? What is this thing he's doing? And I called Micah and I was like, I think we should write about this guy because he speaks toddler. It's pretty amazing.
I think one of the biggest questions for a lot of people, definitely for myself going into this movie, is, when crafting a story around Mr. Rogers, obviously any cinematic tale needs its conflict and its intrigue and its drama, and here you're crafting a story set around this guy who was like a living saint.
Yeah, he was like unwaveringly awesome for 74 years.
Exactly, and I think you guys found a supremely clever way into it by telling his story through the eyes of this very highly cynical journalist played by Matthew Rhys. But how aware were you guys of that challenge going into it? And was that ever a struggle at any point?
I mean, we knew quickly that Fred Rogers is not the ideal protagonist of like a traditional biopic. He was unwaveringly amazing for 73 years. He was too, our director says he was too evolved to be the protagonist because you want to see someone change. But what he was confrontationally kind, and he would get involved in your life. And so this is the story of a journalist whose life is kind of in shambles, and he's given this assignment to profile Fred Rogers, and Fred Rogers, in a weird way, is the antagonist in our movie, because he's not gonna let our main character write his profile. until he helps him overcome the things that are happening in his own life.
I know director Marielle Heller has sort of gone out of her way to tell people that this is not a biopic. It's not, or at least it's not a traditional biopic. Did you guys feel like along the way that you had to sort of temper expectations in terms of Mr. Rogers not being the main character? And also, was that ever a challenge for you guys in actually getting this movie made?
I think people's expectations were really what we took upon ourselves. There's a big obligation, a serious obligation to like get Fred right. I think, like Micah said early on, we knew that we were not the guys to write that movie, the movie where it's the Fred Rogers biopic, because in our minds there really isn't a Fred Rogers biopic. I mean, there's the documentary, which is incredible and does a really amazing job of like giving sort of the bird's eye view of Fred and Fred's message and Fred's life. And as far as a narrative piece of entertainment, as a movie, like we just didn't feel like there was a story there, so we knew we had to look to next to Fred, like look to the people that Fred helped and changed their lives, and there were many of them. There were many of them that we were lucky enough at some point to be led into the Fred Rogers archive in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Joanne Rogers and Bill Eisler eventually kind of welcomed us in, and this is an amazing place, this archive. I mean, you put on white gloves and you handle these letters and these emails and these, this memorabilia as if it's an artifact, right? And there are boxes and boxes and boxes of correspondence between Fred and hundreds of people, daily correspondence, letters, emails, where he is just inserting himself into people's lives in their most vulnerable moments and helping them. So that we were lucky in that we had access to that and saw like, oh, well, that could be our story.
Yeah. What was the process for you guys of gaining the trust of those people that were, ultimately the key holders in terms of his life rights?
It was long, and it was hard, and it was the piece of this project that took the longest, and was in many ways most essential to getting this film made. We knew we had to make this movie in partnership with the Fred Rogers people. We knew we had to have the buy-in of Joanne Rogers, Fred's wife. And they are justifiably protective over this man. I mean, he's a treasure. And they wanted to make sure that we weren't going to mess things up or say, or be irresponsible with that undertaking. And it took a long time to earn their trust. But eventually we got to meet with Joanne, we got to sit down with her, and that was it. Like that, after that meeting, after that conversation with Joanne, we felt like we were going to finally get the blessing of the estate, and then we can move forward.
I mean, Fred was very, very smart, obviously, but he was very protective of his own legacy and of his own message. And I think, he actually divided the rights to Mr. Rogers into 3 different entities. So it's his company, the Fred Rogers Company, and Joanne Rogers, his widow, and then his nonprofit, the McFeely Foundation. And between those 3, all of the rights were contained.
Okay.
So he very, very wisely made it very difficult.
It was like the Triforce they had to put together.
Yeah.
It's like one of them owns the music, the other one owns the sets, and
You guys were basically, not to keep going back to comic books, but you guys were basically like putting together the Infinity Gauntlet
Yes.
of life rights.
Of life rights.
exactly.
Right. Oftentimes, and again, we've established that this is not a biopic or a straightforward biopic, but oftentimes with biographical stories, you'll hear the term warts and all used, and it's typically used as a compliment. The question is, did Mr. Rogers have any warts that you guys think you found and have put on the screen?
For sure. I mean, there's a mystery about Fred Rogers at the center of this film, which is where did all of this hurt and suffering that he would absorb from other people go? How did he deal with it? And we know from Joanne and from Bill, for the people from the estate, that he had ways of dealing with it. He swam every day. He would bang on the keys of the piano. He would pray. But when we tried to really kind of dig in, we asked Joanne. We said, where does all this stuff go? And she said, you know, we never really talked about that. You should go ask Bill. And so we go to Bill and we'd say, Bill, like, where does all the suffering go? And he said, you know, we never really talked about that. You should go ask Joanne. and we realized that there was something about him in sort of this emotional judo that he was playing that makes him a little difficult to fully understand. There was a mystery to him, and we don't feel like we ever got to fully crack it. But we wanted to leave a lot of clues about how he deals with these things in the movie. So they're there. There are warts. You know, Joanne said, the only thing that matters to me about how you portray Fred is that you not portray him as a saint. Because if you turn him into a saint, then what he does is not attainable. And we tried to do that. But I would say relative to most other people, he was pretty freaking amazing.
And you see him in the film sort of bristle at that description of
Yes.
himself. He didn't seem fully comfortable with people looking at him in that light.
Right. Yeah, I think Joanne's point is that he worked very hard at this way of life, of listening intently and helping and being empathetic. I mean, he worked at it, and I think her point is, you can do it too. You know, it's not like he was just put on this earth to be this. You know, he worked at it, and it became a practice for him.
10-12 year journey bringing this film from page to screen. I imagine the screenplay evolved in certain regards or changed over the years. How would you guys say, what are some examples of how it did over the years? How would you say it evolved most dramatically?
Well, it's funny. Well, to not answer that question, one of the funny things is that, like, we had to go back and look at the scripts recently to sort of create the final script, and from the very first draft, the opening is exactly the same. So it's the same scene 10 years ago, or I guess it was 9 years ago, when we actually wrote it. It was like exactly the same, except for like a couple words here and there, and the minute of silence was still there. The end of the movie was the same. And now to answer your question, I think, you know, like the heart of the movie was always the same, the structure was the same, but we did not have the rights to the Esquire article until probably halfway through the process. And we had other stories. Originally, it was called I'm Proud of You, and we were using Tim Madigan's book, which is a very similar story of a journalist who kind of has his life saved by Mr. Rogers after getting an assignment. And there were versions along the way where it was other stories and other people's lives that we got from the archive. But once we read those letters in the archive between Tom Junot and Fred Rogers, because we had known about the article, you know, for the whole process.
Yeah.
But we saw this box marked Tom Junot, and it was hundreds of letters that they had written back and forth over the 5 years up until Fred died.
It was crazy. It felt super voyeuristic.
Because it was super voyeuristic.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, that for us was a moment of like, oh, this is the story. This is like a thing that lasted a very long time, was very real, and there was a lot talking about his relationship with his father and his relationship as a new dad, and those things really sort of rounded out what became our movie.
It was this entire friendship that was just in these letters.
Yeah.
But I mean, you talk to other screenwriters, like, you know, it's like there's like a script is it's a living document until, you know, often through post. It's something that, you know, is designed just to convene the cast and the crew, and as we learned things about Fred Rogers, as we found new information, we just put it in, and we would see how it worked. And luckily, because we had so much time to work on this thing, we got to have it evolve to this place.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys if there were other characters involved at different points, but it sounds like there was an entirely different journalist initially whose eyes we were going to see this story through.
Yep.
Wow. Did you guys ever try to incorporate, I mean, going to you mentioned the documentary, that was a big hit a year ago. Francois Clemens was a vital part of that story. Did you guys explore looking at incorporating him in some way?
Yeah, there's the period in the movie where Lloyd Vogel is doing research and sort of watching clips and absorbing. And we definitely had a couple Francois moments, the washing of the feet, and I think it's 1968, which is so intentional and so amazing and so
Yes.
part of, it's like a civil rights act to do that. And that scene was in there, and a couple other scenes, and I think, just you can't put them all in.
Right.
It really had to fit with the theme of the movie of forgiveness. There's one song in particular called "You Can Never Go Down the Drain" that we love, which is a song that Fred found out that kids had a very real fear of like going down the drain in the bathtub
Because they're so little in their minds that they're going to go down.
I get that.
So he wrote a song called "You Can Never Go Down the Drain," and it's like the most beautiful, bizarre, and we're just like, oh, we can't put it in. There's no way to put it in, but there's lots and lots of those things.
For me, I think my bathroom fear is more like a goblin was going to come out of the toilet. That was like from a horror movie.
He wrote a
in the
song
80s.
called
Did he write
"Goblins
it?
Cannot Come Out of the Toilet" too.
I was wondering
It's
about
really
that.
catchy.
A song for anything.
I was wondering about that. So obviously, you wrote this well before that doc came out. But did you guys look at it? Did it then inform your the evolution of your own script in any way?
We know Morgan, and along the way, he was like, I'm thinking about making a movie about Fred Rogers, and we met with him, and I think sort of smugly we're like, it will never come out before ours. Yeah. and of course it did, and it's a beautiful, beautiful movie. And I think what, aside from just being a beautiful movie, what it did for our movie is it put a lot of these moments into the consciousness of the people that would be hopefully coming to see our movie. So we had to do less work because Morgan had already educated a lot of people with the details of Fred's life and his like core beliefs and his message, and some of these like intricate sort of beautiful moments like Fred in front of Congress. And that's like it's a big part of the doc, and so like just a little bit of it in our movie, and sort of like a moment where Fred is sort of haunting Lloyd Vogel, and so people see that clip and they're like, oh, I know that whole story, and so we don't have to explain the whole story. I think they are really wonderful companion pieces to each other. And Mike always says, like, if we have 10 Marvel movies in a year, can't we have 2 Fred Rogers movies in back-to-back years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, and I think you guys hinted at this earlier, but that documentary made the argument that Fred Rogers was a radical in his own way, especially in terms of civil rights and social acceptance.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
assume you guys agree with that stance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also like he was both like ahead of his time and also represents some of the best parts of sort of the traditions of like American education of childhood development. He was sort of both of these things, and like I think he was a radical also for being such a television auteur. I mean, he wrote every single song. He voiced almost every single puppet. This was a world that he created entirely.
He wrote every episode.
He wrote every episode.
I mean, it's over 1,000 episodes.
And just to be able to like dive deep into his creative mind, and you watch it as an adult, especially with how fast things are today, and you see how much he can slow down your breathing. It almost feels a little bit psychedelic to watch it as an adult, because you realize how quickly your mind is moving. I caught myself 3-screening it the other day. I had like my phone out, my laptop in my lap, and I was watching something. And of course, I was doing none of those things. I was just distracting myself from distracting myself. And Fred Rogers is someone who just like, he actually took the time to see you and to pay respect to you and the child that you are, or the child in you, and just to hold that space. That was the magic that he had.
And there are, sorry to cut you off there are psychedelic aspects, I think, to the film,
Full
which
on.
sounds how those were informed now.
We wanted the movie to feel like Fred. We wanted it to feel like an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for grown-ups. And because of the visual language that he has already, the neighborhood of make-believe, the puppets, sort of like he did operas, like kind of the dream-like quality of some of the stuff, it allowed Noah and I to make a movie that we hope is more unexpected and is a little weirder than I think people are walking into the theater expecting to see. I think sometimes we can be too respectful in our biopics, and we can, tell these like cradle to grave stories. And for us, that was never the way in. That never felt creatively like the right way in. Not just because of who Fred is, but because of what his show was, and we felt responsibility to give our audience the feeling of the show.
Like to ask, like when Fred asks the question on the show and then just waits for the television neighbor to answer it on their end. It's like one of my favorite things that I think Tom Hanks and Marielle really captured well when he asks a question and then just waits.
Yeah. Because if you have kids, your kids are answering.
They really are.
They're answering
out loud.
them. Yeah, and it really is. I think at its core about as much about his impact on our culture than it is about him. Yeah. The film is directed by Marielle Heller, who I think is one of the most exciting filmmakers to come along in years.
She's such a
Diary of
badass.
a Teenage Girl, Can You Ever Forgive Me? Was brilliant. Those films decided a little edgier. They had a certain darkness to them. But do you guys see this film sort of sharing any DNA with her previous work?
I think all of her work is rooted in the characters and in the acting. I mean, it's kind of her superpower is to get these performances, vulnerable, risky performances from actors. Sometimes people who have been doing it for many, many years and have their thing that they do really well. And she just she earns their trust, and then she slowly walks them out of their shell and gets them to do things that are so powerful. So I think the DNA, like that DNA is in all of those movies. I think they all have a similar sort of color palette. I mean, she really has a look to her movies. I think
And
they're all about writers.
Yeah.
Sure.
And they all feel like very handmade, and that was so important to this movie to make it feel like, we had a whole second shoot, which is just the miniatures. Which were made by hand. We were shooting on these old pedestal cameras that she had tracked down with a 4:3 aspect ratio. It's like kind of it's like slow cooking, It's like she did it all the ingredients are there. But when I was saying about how she directs actors, I mean, I think Noah and I certainly took Tom Hanks for granted, that he would just show up and deliver this performance. And I think the preparation that he did, because his energy is nothing like Fred Rogers' energy. He is up and he talks fast and he's an extrovert. And what Mari and he did to get him to slow down, to get him to hold space, to get him to feel comfortable in silence, that's what makes the movie. I mean, watching them work together in the opening of the movie, which is the opening of the television show, was insane. It was, if you think about what an actor has to do, what Mr. Rogers did every single time he was on the show, you walk in, you take your, you take off your jacket, you put on the cardigan, you take off your shoes, you change your shoes, you tie your shoes, and then you deliver a monologue, and it's all one shot, all while singing, and it's all one shot. And I think they did 30 takes, just over and over again until they got it. And to Mari's credit, we never got that perfect take because that wasn't what Fred Rogers did.
Right.
He was always showing you that he was human. He was always showing you that this was possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you, by the way, for providing the perfect segue, because we have to talk about Mr. Hanks, who plays Mr. Rogers. I mean, what an exceptional performance. He's just magical in this movie. Obviously, you're writing it with Mr. Rogers in mind, but at what point are you guys talking about what actors you could foresee in this role?
Right. I mean, I think from our very first conversations, we're like, do we want to even embark on this? Because who can play this role? Who can pull this off?
Yeah.
And it was Tom Hanks.
Yeah,
Tom Hanks can pull this off.
We could dream.
We can dream, can't we? And we had sent him the script years and years ago, and he had passed. And when Marielle came on, she asked us, who have you always wanted to play Fred Rogers? And we were like, well, Tom Hanks, but let's get real. And she kind of like cut us off and was like, whoa, 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 like, let me ask him. Let's give me a shot. And she called Tom Hanks, as
As you do.
as one does.
I think she knows Colin, right?
Yeah.
She had a relationship with Colin.
Yeah, and he said yes, and then Micah and I lost our minds. That's how it pretty much went.
Yeah. That was it.
Yeah.
That was it. How did you recover from that?
It hasn't happened.
Yeah.
It's still.
No.
We're still on that ride.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned he passed. Did you ever get to the point where you had sort of like other actors in mind who could pull this off?
No. No. I mean, it's you have to start thinking other ways.
Yeah.
But we never let that go.
I mean, there are these actors, there's like the kind of like chameleon actors who could do like Christian Bale I feel like he could become anybody. And there's a kind of performance that you could have, I guess, had for a Fred Rogers where it was like a perfect impersonation. But by doing so, you make the experience of watching it about how well they pulled off like the prosthetics or the magic trick of taking somebody and turning them into somebody else. I think what Tom Hanks does is he forges this sort of spiritual connection between himself and Fred Rogers, and he gives you the feeling of Fred without you kind of he's not inviting the audience to nitpick, how well he does X or Y or Z thing. And people have said they watch it and there's this, the opening is the first thing you see is just Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers walking in onto the set, walking in that door and singing. And for us, it was always this kind of this gauntlet that we throw down. We're like, no, we're not going to hide the fact that there's an actor playing Fred Rogers, and we're inviting you just to accept the fact that, like, this is a movie, and then this is Tom Hanks.
I imagine that had to be, though, one of the most surreal aspects to this project. Like being on set for this, watching Tom Hanks, a living legend, transform into this American treasure, Mr. Rogers, on a daily basis.
Like
Treasure
squared.
over and over again. And they do, like Fred Rogers and Tom Hanks, and I think one of the reasons why we were so interested in it is they seem to occupy the same spot in America's consciousness of like this person you grew up with, you have feelings about them, kind of like them, but you probably have never met them.
He's like our other dad.
He's like our other dad, who's like, I don't know if you're talking about Fred or Tom.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's my point. They're both our other dads, right? And so I think that like that's why we were always so interested, and why we're so lucky to have him, is that they do, like, you bring that to the theater with you.
Did you guys see the clip on Jeopardy where none of the contestants could name Tom Hanks playing Mr. Rogers?
Yeah. I mean, I heard that like there was some malfunction or something.
Oh, was there?
It was technology. It wasn't that people.
I was going to say Tom Hanks is that good that people couldn't even recognize Tom Hanks in that performance, but that makes me feel better about Jeopardy contestants.
People in the audience were losing their mind when they saw it. They're like, no, it wasn't working. Everyone knows who Tom Hanks is. Everyone knows. Everyone knows who Mr. Rogers is.
That is amazing. How do you think people would respond to Mr. Rogers today? I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, maybe the film is making a point that we've become too cynical,
I don't know.
and that we would be too cynical of him today.
Well, he thought that. I mean, he said, even right before he died, I think he said it in 2002 or 2003, that he wouldn't be allowed to do what he does now.
Yeah.
Like now, he wouldn't be accepted. There would not be a place for him on television. And I think he was sad about that.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm sad about that. I think in watching the movie so many times with audiences now, and seeing the effect that he still, through the movie, through Tom Hanks, through this whole project is having on people, it's like he's challenging them to live their life slower and kinder and listen and to be empathetic. And that's actually happening with people in the audience. They actually are taking that upon themselves. And I don't know, we desperately need him right now. I think we are. We obviously are in cynical times. where we're not allowed to listen to other people's ideas. Like really listen, like ask the question and then wait for the answer. You know, like he was doing. We're not allowed to do that. So hopefully we'll start, you know?
Yeah. You guys are having a busy year. You also wrote Maleficent, Mistress
Yeah,
of Evil.
we did.
Basically like the same movie.
Same
like,
movie.
Are you guys afraid that you're going to get a little pigeonholed now after writing 2 movies that are basically identical?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of cardigans and wings and horns.
Yeah, no, but tell us about your experience. I mean, it had to be fun. I mean, that's another actor that's just chewing up a performance.
Angelina
Jolie.
yeah.
Tell us about
She's a force.
writing for her.
She's a force. I mean, so, you know, Noah and I ended up working on Maleficent. We're among several writers, and they were they had a date that they wanted to begin filming, and they brought us in to kind of work up to that date, and to make sure that things were all there and making sense for the shoot. And I mean, that movie hinges entirely on Angelina Jolie and her performance and her command of this character. And she's a movie star. And you kind of, like, even more than Tom Hanks, who you feel like you kind of know. With Angelina Jolie, there's still this like moment where, you know, you're in a meeting and she turns to you and you're like, whoa, like I felt like my hair blew back. And, you know, we would pitch lines that Maleficent would say, and she would often say, I'll do it with a look. And you meet her and you're like, oh yeah, you can totally do that with a look.
Yeah, you said like you asked about writing for her specifically. It's like you kind of don't. You kind of just like get the idea of the line, and then she's like, here's how Maleficent would say it. And you go, thank you. And then she does it. Or she says, yeah, like I'll do it with a look. I'll do it with a look.
Yeah.
And then she does it with a look.
Were there any notes that you guys got from Tom that like sort of stick out in your mind to the same degree?
No.
Yeah.
We got no notes from Tom.
Wow.
Yeah, he was like, read the script, he said he was in. He's like, I'm in, but you have to wait for a year because I have this other movie I have to do. And we're like, okay, we'll wait. And then we just like sent him everything, every clip, every episode, everything we could find. And when you're dealing with someone like that, you don't really like, there's no like on deck circle. You don't get to see him take practice swings before he goes up to bat. You just kind of, he shows up and you're like, well, what's he gonna do? What he did was incredible. I mean, he actually, the first day he was there, he was in full costume for a photo shoot, and we had like a rehearsal for the next morning. And it was the scene when they're at Jerry's house, and he comes over with the pie. And so we're all just sitting around waiting for rehearsal, and he like knocks on the door, and he said, "Am I in the right place?" And he does like in his voice, and he's fully dressed, and everyone was like, oh my God, he's here. We're going to be okay. This is going to be amazing. Not only are we going to be okay.
Everyone's crying.
Everyone's like, is it going to work? Mr. Rogers is here. Yeah, and you know, he like kind of instantly blew us away.
Yeah.
He just did the work. He did so much prep, and it just showed.
Yeah.
You know, so I think any questions that he had for us, he had a whole process kind of internally, and he worked through everything. And so when he was there on the day, he was there to, you know, to work with Marielle to get that performance right, and it was a marvel.
And I imagine waiting another year was not a big deal after waiting 10 years
nothing.
to get
What's a
to
year?
get Tom Hanks
Year.
on board.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's still 5 weeks left in the year. Do you guys have any other movies coming out this year, or is that it? That's it. That's it. What's next for you guys?
We're still trying to figure that out.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're gonna like continue doing the press for this movie, and it's been so fun, and it's been such a long time coming that I think we really want to enjoy that. And we're working on lots of stuff, but it's unclear what our very next thing's gonna be.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, congrats again.
Thank you.
You guys killed it on this.
Thanks.